me introduce you.
So given that people are from all different places or region in the world, should I speak slowly with my English? Is that going to be helpful to people?
I think so, yeah.
Because
There's
once
no
I
from
start,
Taiwan nodded hard. Yeah. Yeah. Slowly will be good.
Okay.
Let me, John.
Hi there.
Solomon.
Great.
So I was about to, John is from U.S. I just introduced all the students different backgrounds, but he's also from Taiwan. He has been here for 25 years?
Over 20.
Over 20.
Over 20 starting
and in China too,
1982.
and in France too, and over here. But anyway, I was about to introduce Brett. He has been here for this biopolitics evidence subjectivation conference in 2009. And then he was talking about labor and so on, biopolitics and translation at that time. About filtering and differentiating labor mobility. So we actually noticed that his interest or concern for labor migration has a long history, even far earlier. But 2013, he was also in Taipei in a conference on abundant except Asia, but he talked about there's no migrant labor or labor force in abundant, right? I guess. Beyond the logical exception, politics without action or economy without labor, something like that, or something commodity.
And then I wrote about the zones, I think, for the publication that came out in Concentric. Yeah.
So Brett Neilson, Professor Brett Neilson, he said already we noticed that he has a long engagement or inquiries into the question of globalization. Particularly, he would focus on the social and cultural dimensions. And his background is English, University, but like many of us, starting from literature, moving more and more into political philosophy or political economic philosophy, but also contemporary issues. That's something that we are bound to do. So he draws from cultural and social theories and also empirical and archival research. That's also very similar to the orientation of our institute, social research and cultural studies. So he has a wide range of research on this contemporary problems and predicament of this globalization, global financial market, the pressure of population aging, and the growing heterogeneity of labor. His current project is on logistics of global governance. It is really a very interesting concept, logistics. It is not only the shipping of commodity, shipping of material, or and the so-called supply line, or there's a demand in the consumer line, but it is a whole network of infrastructures involving the shipping of people, shipping of through this wartime dispositive in this trade business, but that would have great impact on local societies, not to mention the environment pollution, the changes of landscape of poor cities, urban area, other factories, and so on. But also the impact on local communities, for example, the civic reactions against it, or this juridical network to support the shipping of labors and so on. So all these are something that actually Brett had done and written with different scholars. For example, Temple Masada, who came last year, and working on frontiers and boundaries and multiplication of labor in the global world, or border as methods, or the keywords. That's a lot of it we have read in different classes. And he has edited interesting volumes, Logistical Asia, the labor of making the world region, or climate change and museum future. So apparently he's also involved with art and how art demonstrates or act upon contemporary society or social issues. And also drug in motion, mind and body altering substances in the world's cultural economy. And also aging. This is also one of Chu's project. Aging, anti-aging and globalization, transition and limits in the governance of aging. And there are several other interesting articles. Of course, operations of capital, and still waiting, extraction, logistics, finance, global crisis, and the politics of operation, and politics between inclusion and exclusion of the topology of global space and borders. The word seen from a taxi. Students, migrants, workers in the global multiplication of labor. So for students who are interested in the questions of globalization or this migration or the or circulation of capital, well, we need to understand the logic behind it. So Professor Brett Neilson has done a lot. So we really are looking forward to his talk, especially this One Belt One Road initiative and how that will bring all these changes along this Silk Road. And we would like to we look forward to his talk and his research in the past. And tomorrow at noon, we will also listen again about his oncoming project on automatism.
There's one.
Bank.
There's one in progress on data centers.
Yeah.
Server farms in Asia.
Server.
Yeah. And then there's a new one in preparation about automation.
Automation. The cybernetic or this cyber circulation or control, security control, and everything is a huge. The algorithm is a control calculation. So that's welcome, Professor Brett Neilson.
So thank you, Joyce, for the introduction, and thank you all for coming today and for having me here and supporting the travel. It's very appreciated, and I look forward very much to having an intense dialogue, which hopefully we can extend beyond the time of this visit, which unfortunately has had to be quite brief. So today I'm going to talk about the Logistical Worlds project, which is a project I've been involved with since the end of 2011. This is when we first looked for funding for this project, and it's really just run for 5 years, so it's just finished, and been doing other things in the meantime, but this has been the main project I've worked on for the last 5 years. It's a project that's been based around shipping ports, and we've been trying to look at the practices of logistics as a way of getting in behind the dynamics of globalization. So very simply, we could say that one of the main metaphors we use to explain global movement is flow. Whether that's a movement of people or things, it's a prevalent idiom. But flow is a hydraulic metaphor, and maybe not all things that move flow. So to investigate logistics provides one way of getting into this question, not only at a kind of metaphorical level, but at an empirical level, which allows us to ask, well, if things move, what are the techniques and the technologies that enable this movement in the world today? So we have concentrated on shipping ports, but the conception of logistics that we've been working with and have developed is not, I would say, merely confined to the sector of transportation. We don't conceive of logistics as an economic sector given to transportation and or communication as a limited slice of the global economy. Of course it is this, and we can observe this, we've observed this in the last 20 years of, every small ma and pa trucking company now has repainted the side of their vehicle to say something like, future logistics or, global logistics on the sides of trucks. This is a transformation that we have seen and we can track. So it certainly is such a sector. But the conception of logistics we've been developing is wider than this. I'm not going to offer a definition because the thought around logistics, I think, has moved with the project and moved with an international debate around logistics. I know I've given Joyce a reading list, so some of you will be aware of the contours of that debate. They're important groups with whom we're in dialogue, working from, say, the University of Toronto in geography, working from California, particularly coming out of the Occupy Oakland movement. There are groups in Italy, Germany, and so forth that have given thickness to this debate. But to generalize, we might say that logistics is a mode of governance and a form of power that is involved in rearranging the relations between economy and politics. When we think about what form of power this is, there are obviously theoretical canons we can draw on here, and maybe we want to discuss that later. But I would see logistics as a mode of power that questions the distinction between institution and infrastructure. Okay? Material conduits of movement and social institutions as they're built up. These have typically been different bodies of thought and theory, but I think logistics as a practice forces us to think these things together in productive ways. Logistics also, I think, muddies the distinction between labour and life and forms of life. The muddying of this distinction is one that applies to many other theoretical pursuits, particularly the work around so-called post-Fordism coming out in Europe. And logistics, I think, chimes with some of that debate, but it positions it somewhat differently, okay? Particularly because of the role of digital technologies in the monitoring and control of labour in the logistical workplace. You might want to think about how such a workplace is bounded, but I will come to that later. The other thing I would like to say about logistics, just to start off, is that we can also think of it as a kind of an imaginary, okay? And I would say when we think about logistics, the imaginary that it gives us is one of efficiency and seamlessness, the creation of seamless movement. It seems like a flow because there are no borders and barriers that have to be negotiated on the way. You know, logistical operations are about creating this veneer of efficiency. But this imaginary covers up what I would call the reality of precarity. Okay, because the dissemination of precarious forms of life and labour is very much at the forefront of what logistics is doing socially, and here I'm generalising vastly. So we can also think of logistics as an imaginary of efficiency that papers over precarity. There are many more things to say in a political and economic sense. This website we have up here, we made an initial stab at talking about logistics. This was back in 2011 where we said logistics is the operative dimension of capital. And it creates circulatory regimes of containment. So this relation between production and circulation, to talk in more political economic terms, is also at stake in logistics, the muddying of that barrier. And then to come to our sites, which is what I will talk about mostly today, the three sites of Piraeus, Calcutta and Valparaiso. I'll only talk about Piraeus and Calcutta today. We interestingly wanted to think of these as, we said, no longer cities. These are zones, corridors and concessions that make logistical worlds. So we think about logistics in terms of world making and what it's productive of, but we're also we're deliberately avoiding the notion of the city as one that would give us a conceptual orientation to this problem. Today I won't be talking about so much that aspect of it, but I will be talking about the civis, I guess, in that I'll be talking about some of the kind of civilizational assumptions that haunt logistical worlds. Now, we started this project in 2011. There was an interest in these ports as sites where Chinese international expansion was somehow at stake. And in the official title of the project, which was Infrastructure and Software and Labour Along the New Silk Road, was the subtitle, we used this nomenclature, New Silk Road, really as a kind of unifying device. So it was a pragmatic and, for us, somewhat of a kind of mercenary decision as academics writing a grant application, because we had already chosen our sites and we juggled different possibilities. We thought maybe it would be interesting to have a site in Africa, but we really didn't have the local contacts in order to be able to pursue research, say, in a place like Kinshasa. And we settled on these sites because we knew we had local researchers and collaborators in each of these places with whom we could work. And this idea of the New Silk Road came in later, because when you're writing a grant application, you have to say, well, what does place A, B, and C have to do with each other? And we thought, well, if we just say they're all on the New Silk Road, that gives us a frame for the application, and our assessors couldn't say A doesn't have to do with B, because we would say these are part of the New Silk Road. Okay, so it was really, it came in very late to our thinking. It wasn't at the core of our thought. But this really changed our project. Because in 2013, September 2013, as you all know, Xi Jinping gave his speech where he declared China's interest in what at that time was called the One Belt, One Road program. Now is more frequently called the Belt and Road Initiative. And we were already, our research was already underway at this stage. And when this happened, our research kind of got rolled up into all sorts of other discourses and contexts where we never thought it was going to go. And we were asked to speak in all sorts of different situations that we didn't think we belonged to. And it really kind of shifted the ground of the project as we were moving. Also importantly, we had a Latin American aside, Valparaiso in Chile, which in our thought could be thought about as part of the New Silk Road, but in the Belt and Road Initiative, rhetorics and realities is not counted as part of the initiative, even though China-Latin American relations are very important kind of geopolitical and economic movements in the contemporary world. But the sites we've concentrated on are Piraeus, which is the port of Athens in Greece, and Calcutta. Frequently, they do populate these maps of the Belt and Road Initiative. And we were also able to add, through our collaborations in Germany, a study which we're just finishing up of Duisburg, which is in the very west of Germany, one of Germany's poorest cities, which is the city where the Yuchinao Express, the freight railway coming from Chongqing, terminates in Europe, and the site of an inland port on the Rhine. I've conducted research now, led research teams in 4 different sites, if you like, that are part of this initiative, or one we could argue about whether it's part of it or not. Look, there are all sorts of different maps that you will find, okay? You know, some of them would join Calcutta to Colombo differently and so forth. But the sites I will talk about today, Piraeus and Calcutta, I think do provide something of a contrast, because Piraeus is very much seen as something of the dragon's head of the initiative. And Calcutta, you know, even though it's one of the few places where you have on these maps Belt and Road meeting, so you have a land route meeting a maritime route, is really not a site of intense Chinese investment, and the kind of local concerns there are quite different from the ones you will find in Piraeus. So, as I'm sure you're aware, the debate around this initiative at the moment is intense, and there's all sorts of different positions. The one you find most prevalently in Anglosphere English language debate is that this is a geopolitical initiative, that it's about China's grand strategy, not only economically but also militarily. You find a line of argument that this is more an exercise in debt imperialism or debt colonialism, that it's driven by an overaccumulation of capital in China and the need to export capital, and creating patterns of debt and debt traps, as Mike Pence accused China over the weekend at the APEC summit in Port Moresby. You also find discourses, and some of these have emerged from Taiwan, that sees Belt and Road Initiative as an exercise in decolonization, that fits in with the spirit of bundle. So there has been an issue of inter-Asia cultural studies in which such arguments were presented. So the spectrum of arguments that you have at this kind of meta level about what this initiative is about is wide. And what I want to do is not really get into those arguments, but I want to look on the ground in the actual sites in which I've been working, which is not everything and can never be everything and can only ever be limited and selective. But I do think that working from the kind of perspective that we pursue in the institute that I'm from, and I think this is the kind of cultural studies and social theory perspective that Joyce is mentioning, we do have a strong claim at being able to look at how situations are unfolding in the everyday scenarios in certain sites in the world and how they relate to global transformation and changes. And I think it's at this level we can really intervene, and then maybe we can begin to say something about these grand claims, which are always politicized and always have a sort of agenda behind them. I'm not saying I don't have any agendas, but I'll leave you to figure them out. But this is the approach we have. So with that, let me turn to Piraeus. So this is an aerial shot of the port of Piraeus, of which a part was conceded to the subsidiary of COSCO Pacific in 2009. Now, COSCO Pacific is a Hong Kong listed company, one of the so-called red chip companies on the Hong Kong stock market. And it has a minority, it at the time had a minority holding from COSCO Holdings, which is a holdings company also on the Hong Kong market, which was in turn majority owned by COSCO Group, the Chinese state enterprise. If you look at the board of directors of these companies, you can see that it was all the same people on these different companies. And these people were appointed through political process in China. So this subsidiary that was created is called Piraeus Container Terminals, PCT. And PCT, in 2009, overtook this big kind of square area that you see here in the port. They also undertook to build another pier here, as part of the deal. And this area of the port where you see the orange cranes remained with Piraeus Port Authority, which is a company that was still majority owned by the Greek government in 2009, at the time the concession was made. Now, this concession was made in the depths of an economic crisis that was severe in Greece. Greece was the European country where symbolically and materially the global economic crisis, the so-called subprime crisis of 2007, 2008, and we can argue about whether it was the subprime market in the US that caused the conditions that pertain in Greece. I think it's more complex than that. But nonetheless, this concession to Chinese state enterprise, or at least its subsidiary, happened during the depth of this economic crisis and a time of extreme social antagonism in Greece. The COSCO side of the port was able to introduce new infrastructures that led to massive growth and a massive boost of productivity in this part of the port. It became the fastest growing container port in the world for a couple of years. specifically around that 2014-2015 period. Our fieldwork here was conducted in 2013 and 2014. In 2016, COSCO was able to buy out Piraeus Port Authority. So since August 2016, COSCO has controlled the entire port area. But it's important to understand that in the period in which we were working there, the port was divided into two sections, which were most commonly called by people the Chinese part of the port and the Greek part of the port. Now, you can see these cranes here were installed by COSCO. These are post-Panamax cranes. A post-Panamax crane is a piece of infrastructure that is able to unload a ship that is too big to pass through the Panama Canal before its recent widening. So the Panama Canal was widened, 2 years ago? It opened up. And you can watch some great YouTube videos of really big ships trying to get through just squeezing through the expanded Panama Canal. But what these ships allow COSCO as a kind of shipping company to do is to bring in really big container ships. So if you look up COSCO container ships, I think there's one called the Cosmos, these are some of the biggest ships in the world. And these are ships that steam slowly, okay? So you have ships, very big ships coming from places like Ningbo or Shanghai, ports that would arrive at Piraeus, and Piraeus is a transshipment port. So very few of the commodities that are unloaded here would be bound for the hinterland of this port, which reaches from Greece up into Central Europe. There's a distinct logistical route that leads from this port and is designed within European protocols called TEN-T, that it is a distribution route that distributes up towards Central Europe and into Hungary. Interesting, and this is a side point, this is exactly the same route that became the Balkan route for the Syrian migrants entering Europe in 2015 through Greece, where those people were repelled from the borders of Hungary, and eventually many of them accepted into Germany with great consequences and continued political fallout in that country. Here we have a very interesting case of the logistical routes for commodities following the logistical route for migrants. If we were to be very Marxist about it, we could say, well, this is a route for another commodity, which is labour power, but I'll just let that sit as a side point, but I think it's important to mention it. The other thing about slow steaming that's interesting is that it's a form of slowing down driven by a program of logistical efficiency, which always seeks to increase the turnover time of capital. Okay, so I like this image of slow steaming, that it means we have slowing down at the behest of capital, because it flies in the face of these kinds of arguments we have, particularly from theorists like Paul Virilio, who says that capital is always about speed and everything is always speeding up. This is nice because it shows us how we're sort of compelled to speed up and slow down at the same time. In any case, Piraeus is a European Union free zone, which means that containers can come in, they can be transshipped, which means move to a feeder ship and move to different ports around the Mediterranean from this site. Now, question of the status of this site, its kind of territorial status, is quite interesting because of that free zone application, which is a European Union measure. But the way in which the process in which the concession was made, particularly the August 2016 concession, is interesting because it involved the agency of an organization called the Hellenic Republic Asset Development Fund, okay, which was set up after the first bailout package of Greece. It's basically a privatization agency based on the Treuhand, which was the agency set up after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 2009 to sell off East German public assets to private interests. So this agency was set up, and it had appointments from the so-called Troika, the European Commission, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, who were overseeing this process of privatization of public assets in Greece. And this remaining part of the port was one that was very much in their eyes. Now, when the Syriza government was elected at the beginning of 2015, they initially said, no, we're not going to lease this remaining part of the port to COSCO, but that decision was rapidly reversed as the dramatic events in the middle of 2015 when the Greek population voted no to the third bailout package, but the Syriza government compromised and agreed to it anyway. We now know from the books of the finance minister, Yanis Varoufakis, that they were conducting backroom negotiations with China about the possibility that China would bail out rather than the institutions of the Troika. And Varoufakis tells us that they were very serious and very near to that point, but says it was politically blocked by Germany. But in any case, we did see in 2016 the concession of the other half of the port. Now, the major arguments about these processes in Greece, and particularly on the Greek left, I would say are two. The first is the argument that the Troika's role, this is the commissary technical form of government, through the powers of these three organizations, European Commission, IMF and World Bank, created a form of exception in Greece, where the country lost its sovereignty, at least its economic sovereignty, and the shots were called from above. This is the argument put, for instance, by Kostas Douzinas in his 2012 book, Philosophy and Resistance in the Crisis in Greece. And of course, it's an interesting argument. But what it leaves out is what comes onto the table from China. It doesn't say anything about what is a state-owned enterprise. It doesn't say anything about what are the corporate structures of such an enterprise. It doesn't say what are the political relations that pertain in China. It doesn't even say anything about the COSCO was losing money, and the SASAC, the Commission for State-Owned Enterprises in China, forced it into a merger, first with China Shipping in the beginning of 2016, and then with OOCL, another Chinese container shipping line, to create one big state-owned enterprise in container shipping. All of this stuff about exception says nothing about that. It has no way of thinking about those kinds of transformations. So in our discourses, and when we were doing the research, we were feeding into Syriza radio stations and things when Syriza was still really connected to social movements in Greece. We were trying to put this on the agenda and say you really have to think about this with respect to the port. Now, the other argument that you find, and this was particularly prevalent among the trade unions who were active in the Greek side of the port, was that what was at stake at Piraeus they called a process of Chinification. Okay? So what was happening in Piraeus, they said, is the import of a Chinese labour model, and this they claimed would degrade labour conditions from the kind of conditions that existed in the port before the crisis, when the kind of sacred bond between union and state was broken in the Greek political economy with the onset of the economic crisis. So there were lots of strikes and struggles on the Greek side of the port, and they were driven very much by this rhetoric of we want to stop the Chinification of our workplace, because then our jobs will be, we will have all sorts of benefits that we've enjoyed that will be stripped away. Okay, so we also wanted to question this discourse. Okay, the first way in which we questioned this was to say, well, look, there are ports in China too. What kinds of labour relations exist in them? How do we think about the fact that there's no unions on the COSCO side of the port in Piraeus, but in 2012 and 2013 you had a series of big strikes in Hong Kong and Yantian and the ports in the south of China, which were significant labour struggles in China. Now, we can say all sorts of things about the structure of trade unions in China, and I don't know a lot about this, but I've had conversations with Jack Chu from Chinese University of Hong Kong that tells me that the Yantian strike had intervention way up from within the party in China to stop it, because there's a chance of the activities spilling out from the official trade union circuits into more informal forms of labour activism. But whatever the case that happened with those strikes is very different from what's happening in COSCO and Piraeus. So how can you say that you've got a Chinification of the port happening if the setup you have in this port is very different from that pertains in the ports of China? It just doesn't make sense. But this is the dominant rhetoric that's driving labour activism. What do you get with this rhetoric? This is from our field work when we entered the Greek side of the port in 2014. You get these kinds of varieties of sentiment scrawled on the wall. You know, very familiar for me as an Australian who lived through the 1980s in universities where there was all sorts of awful graffiti like this scrawled around. But this is the I see it very much as the kind of flip side of that rhetoric of Chinification. Okay? When we entered this space and then we went up into the control room where they were running the software to unload and load ships within the stacking areas on the Piraeus Port Authority's side of the port, we saw this cartoon stuck to the wall. And the script reads something like the Greek prostitute says to the Chinese gentleman, I'm just a whore. I only hire my body out. If you want to buy something, the port is for sale. Okay? So it's very clear whenever we talk about labour that race and gender come in as primary kind of categories.
they're not secondary to some kind of class position, but they're right up there in front in the way in which labour is arrayed. And this was very obvious in the case of Piraeus and the way in which the Chinese presence was being read on the Greek side of the port. Now, I don't want to paint Greek trade unions as racist and so forth. I mean, these trade unions have done a lot to counter Golden Dawn, the kind of extreme right-wing movement in Greece with its kind of anti-migrant sentiments. But nonetheless, this is what we found hanging on the wall. So the relation between the Chinification thesis and these forms of representation, I think, is something that has to be worked through, because it's one of the things that's happening on the ground, or was happening on the ground in this site in 2014. But to go, to flip round to say from this thesis we get racism, I think is too much, too quick and too reflexive a reading, because we've got to go deeper than that. Because the civilizational claims on this space and the way they inflect the rhetoric and the arguments around what was happening in Piraeus port are serious. Has anyone ever read a book called The Republic by Plato? Does anyone remember what the first sentence of that book is? The first sentence of that book is, "I went down to the Piraeus yesterday." This foundation text of Western metaphysics and politics is linked precisely to this place. So when you have Chinese state enterprise moving in and having a concession arrangement in this space, the way in which the rhetoric of civilizational tussle can dominate the argument is not inconsequential. Okay? So, I don't know, in this kind of diagram of the port, where you see two spaces demarcated that are moving homogeneously through time together until August 2016, in which the pink area overtakes the orange area, they're situated like this, one against each other. They can be compared. This is what happens on this side. That's what happens on the other side. We can talk about the kinds of labour relations that pertain in the pink side of the port. Okay. Interestingly, these are subcontracting relations through a company that was appointed to hire labour force by Piraeus Container Terminals, and this same company is very active in the cleaning sector in Greece. Now, the cleaning sector in terms of labour relations in Europe has been a particular point of pressure because the subcontracting relations are multiple. So people like Valerie Alzaga, who maybe John has come across from Unite the Union, has been very active in organising migrant workers in the cleaning sector around issues like, well, when you've got a chain of subcontractors, who do you strike against? Do you strike against the bottom of the chain or up the top? I mean, these are the kind of issues, but the same labour arrangement pertained in this space, and the main difference was that the workers on the COSCO side of the port were all Greek men, like the workers on the Greek side of the port, except they were younger. So on the Greek side of the port, the workers were Greek men in their 50s and 60s, and on the COSCO side of the port, Greek men in their 30s and 40s. The COSCO workers are more educated. Many of them had tertiary degrees, and they were certainly people who were gendered, so they didn't have caring responsibilities. So the kind of precarity regime that comes with that structure of employment allow them to come in, they were called to work through text messages, often only a couple of hours before they had to be on the site. I'll come to the kind of techniques behind that soon. But the point is that this kind of model adapted from the way the cleaning industry is working Europe-wide. It's very different from the model of port labour in a Chinese port. So our technique of studying this was quite peculiar. You know, in this space, the particular area we were really interested in is this line here. Okay? This border, I have to go back, how do I do that? That separated the two sides of the port. And I was never able to enter this side of the port, but I did 2 or 3 times enter this side of the port. I was able to walk right up to here and stand on this side and say, what's happening here? What's going on here? How do we understand this arrangement? And this is only one way of representing the arrangement, which I don't think is the best way. And our way of getting into this problem we call follow the software. Okay? So when you're doing big multi-site projects,